So now 10th edition 40k is out in full force, with points and rules available for all armies. Let's talk about the strongest and weakest armies in the game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're doing a tier ranking of the power level of Warhammer 40k armies right now, talking through every single faction in the game, how it looks like they're stacking up against the other armies power-wise, and some of the most interesting and powerful rules and units from each index. Obviously in 10th edition Warhammer 40k really quite a lot has changed. Games Workshop's rewritten every single datasheet in the game to some extent, and there's really quite big and powerful army and faction rules plus detachment rules to warp everything a bit further. The rules haven't been out for very long at the time of recording, so this is a bit of an early impression. It'll be definitely something to check back later though when we have a bit more tournament data, and we can really see which armies are truly on top or struggling a bit when players have had a decent amount of chance to play test and really pick the good stuff out of each codex. Seeing as everything is really quite untested at the moment, I thought for this tier list I'd ask for impressions for you guys in a great big poll, and we'll go through in the order as ranked by you. I have used my own discretion a little bit to draw where the tier lines are between different armies. Obviously in reality it's all a bit of a continuum, and in general I do agree with the order that they're ranked in. It seems very sensible to me. There's perhaps one or two things that I might have felt were maybe a little bit overvalued or undervalued, which we'll talk through at the time, but for the most part I'm pretty much in agreement with your guys' rankings. With all that in mind, I've separated the voted armies into 4 different tiers, with one particularly standout faction at the top. I thought it will be useful to talk through every single army in the game, their core mechanics, some of their strengths and weaknesses, and some of their most standout units in terms of power for the points cost and strongest rules out of their index. Feel free to let me know any further insights as to your faction. I'm sure I'll miss quite a bit of important stuff in this, so let me know any cool combos or particularly powerful rules that might be undervalued by first reading. Starting out then, I feel that these are 3 of the armies that are struggling the most in Warhammer 40k at the moment. They were voted the lowest power by you guys, and perhaps seem to be setting off into 10th edition with a pretty shaky start, and rules that are certainly going to have them struggling with some of the top factions in the game. Here we've got Death Guard, Adeptus Mechanicus, and the Leagues of Votann. First up, and voted very lowest by you guys, are the Death Guard. While some of the index previews that Games Workshop did were maybe a bit misleading, it seems that everyone's pessimism about the Death Guard did seem to bear out fairly well with the reveal of their index. Just compared with a lot of factions, I do feel like there really isn't all that much to be excited about. The army rule is Gift of Nurgle, which admittedly I think is decent enough. That's a -1 toughness aura expanding throughout the game. Very handy to have in combat, though a little bit lackluster against certain very tough datasheets. Vehicles and things aren't going to care about it anywhere near as much as they used to. The detachment rule, Spread the Sickness, I think is kind of weak. It gives you infected objective markers and sticky objectives for the whole faction. Not awful, but also something that quite a lot of armies that can do just with one or another datasheet, and even then it's only really insurance against you failing battle shock or getting shot off the point when your opponent can't take it. Otherwise, for their datasheet changes, they do have really quite a lot of lethal hits from their plague weapons, which does mean that their small arms can do a fair bit of chip damage to tougher stuff. Though, much to the annoyance of quite a few Death Guard players, they have lost any sort of innate durability rule. The -1 damage went away with nothing really to replace it, and there are a lot of factions that seem to get feel no pain type saves quite a bit easier than the Death Guard. The stratagems and enhancements also aren't enormously outstanding. Damage and durability buffs mainly, and the kind of okay but not standout ones. Maybe one of the best being that one for sustained hits too if you're on an infected objective marker. From a look at the codex, I feel like a few of the support characters did seem to be pretty efficient. The Tallyman with his command point farming and +1 to hit, the Biologist Putrefier for damage, and the Blight Spawn for fights first all seem nice. The Plague Burst Crawlers and Demon Engines seem okay, perhaps particularly the Plague Burst Crawlers if you've got a Lord of Virulence to spot for them. And I feel like one of the strongest damage combos might be the Lord of Contagion with Death Shroud Terminators fishing for the lethal hits. They could perhaps get into the battle pretty nicely with Rapid Ingress. Broadly though, I feel like the theme of the datasheets is they just seem really quite overcosted, not a whole load of damage, and perhaps even slower than they were before, really not great in the age of tactical objectives where you might want to be zooming around the board quite quickly. I feel like all of that might have been bearable if their defensive stats were okay. I feel like they are kind of okay, but just not really outstanding. I certainly not want to compare them too much to Adeptus Custodes, who have similar or better durability on a lot of units and also stacks of damage. Definitely an army that's going to have its challenges, starting with 10th I think. Moving on, just slightly escaping worst army in 40k by your vote was the Adeptus Mechanicus. Their army rule is the Doctrina Imperatives. That gives your guns either heavy or assault, and a bit of AP buffs or debuffs depending on yours or your opponent's deployment zones. Not terrible, but still only affects a subset of your units. The Rad Bombardment rule is kind of weird. either battle shock or some mortal wounds turn 1, and then a few chip mortal wounds during the course of the game. It's vaguely annoying for your opponents, but still not the biggest damage dealer in the world, and not too hard to avoid with certain units if you play kind of aggressively. For the better stratagems and enhancements, they do get advance and charge. A reactive -1 to wound in the fight phase is quite nice, and returning fire is useful when that comes up. For stronger units, I feel like a lot of lists are going to be falling back on Cataphron Breachers, more expensive than the destroyers, but probably some of the better firepower in the faction with those heavy arc rifles, maybe using tech priests like the Manipulus or Core to make them better. Skitarii Vanguard perhaps seem to be the way to go between them and Rangers. The Rangers are just surprisingly overcosted at 120 points. Broadly speaking, it just feels like they've lost a lot of their overlapping synergies of 9th edition, but a lot of their datasheets didn't really get massive improvements to compensate from that. The Skitarii troops in particular, I feel like went from a powerhouse unit to something a lot more lackluster, partly due to having their saves worsened, and also all the stacking buffs going. Finally, for the lowest tier at the moment, we've got the Leagues of Votann, which admittedly were voted decently higher than the other two, but still very much seem to be a faction that have more issues than most. Their army rule, the Eye of the Ancestors Judgment tokens, has been toned down enormously since 9th edition, which I think was expected, but now the first Judgment token feels like it's only really getting them back to their base stats before, seeing as a lot of the army hits on 4s now. The +1 to wound is nice though, if you can get that off on big tough enemy units. Their detachment's a little bit odd, with 2 Judgment tokens on 1 unit and a command point reward for killing it early. Maybe very helpful in some games, utterly worthless in others. And broadly speaking, the trend of their datasheet is worse weapon skill and ballistic skill, generally really quite a lot cheaper units, particularly certain units like the Iron Here Hearthguard, but as well as the Judgment tokens, they just don't really have quite as many built-in advantages as they did, losing things like Void Armor, Ignores Invul's rail weapons, or their fancy beam things. Their stratagems and enhancements don't seem too bad, but also not crazy standout, several reasonable things to enhance damage in particular. As for the most standout units in the faction, I'd expect things like Iron Here Hearthguard, Carls, and the Mighty Land Fortress to be fairly common picks. I've seen a few people theory crafting lists with just ridiculous amounts of the Iron Here Hearthguard. They just seem a lot more efficient than many of the others. Scouting Sagittars are really quite fun, but again you do pay a bit of a premium for them. Overall, perhaps like the Death Guard, I think they might also struggle with the 10th edition missions being kind of slow. And just overall, a lot of the datasheets seem a bit overcosted for what they do. The drops to their damage output I think have been bigger than the points cost cuts they got. They are of course a faction that's really lacking for options. They don't really have that many datasheets and other things to fall back on if some stuff is weak. Maybe an army that could see some points cost improvements in the future perhaps. Moving onwards and upwards, here we have Tier 3, armies that are rated in lower middle tier in Warhammer 40k. I feel like all of these might struggle against the top factions in the game, but they do all still bring some pretty interesting tricks to the table, and can be decently scary in their own way. Quite a few of them I think are really forced to play into their strengths though, rather than having quite as much flexibility of playstyle compared with some of the other factions, just doing 1 or 2 things really well. Here we've got Space Wolves, Tau Empire, Drukhari, the World Eaters, Sisters of Battle, Orks, Chaos Demons, Astra Militarum, Tyranids, and Blood Angels. First up, and voted lowest of these, were the Space Wolves. I feel it's kind of interesting to rank the Marine sub-factions really. In some ways, the Space Marine sub-factions are basically just kind of regular Space Marines, but with extras. They could just use the Gladius detachment and spam strong datasheets like Desolators if they wanted to. But I feel like when most people were ranking these individual sub-factions, they'll be thinking about an army that makes some at least fairly heavy use of the actual Space Wolf datasheets, and running it in the actual Space Wolf themed detachment as well with the sagas. At least currently I'll count Gladius more under standard Space Marines, and talk through the sub-factions with the idea of using their own detachment. The Space Wolf army rule is Oath of Moment, which always allows big damage, maybe a little bit better with shooting units compared with combat though, just due to delivery and focus fire against one enemy. The detachment rule are those saga things. I must admit this is a rule that really feels like it's often underwhelming, and kind of was in the 8th and 9th codexes as well. Characters doing quests to deliver whole army buffs, but it does feel that just about every one of those quests is kind of a little bit unreliable, or your opponent might have counterplay to them, basically meaning that you could well have an army that just doesn't have any core detachment buffs for really quite a lot of the game unless the stars align. Otherwise, the Space Wolves do have really quite a lot of unique datasheets, though I must admit I'm not surprised to see them ranked down here, given that a lot of them are just a little bit on the costly side, or just don't do a crazy amount of damage. Things like Wolfen, Wolfguard, and Thunderwolf cavalry weapons all being damage 1, or at least if they're not on the charge, that is kind of painful compared with all the crazy threat that they had before. I'm really not too enthused about the stratagems and enhancements as well. A lot of them key off the sagas to actually get good, which as I said do feel pretty unreliable. For standout units, I feel like Bloodclaws aren't too bad for a pretty cheap Marine stat line, You can get quite a lot of power armoured wounds on the board for that, and could clog up objectives pretty nicely. Thunderwolf Cavalry don't seem too bad for around 33 points per model, it's 100 per 3 of them. They do get damage 2 on the charge, which makes them a lot more general purpose, and for the cost they are at least fairly fast and tanky as well. Perhaps surprisingly enough, I feel like Hounds of Morkai are also quite decent, basically boosted Reavers that get a bunch of devastating wounds. I feel like this completely turns the unit around. AP0 attacks are thoroughly disappointing on the Reavers, but getting devastating wounds on those AP0 attacks, and you're kind of in business against most targets in the game. Overall though, I do feel that the Space Wolf detachment is a bit disappointing. Even if you did want to build around Thunderwolves and Wolfen and things like that, you might still be better off in the Gladius for some reliable advance and charge for a turn at least, plus all the other movement shenanigans. Next up, we've got the Tau Empire. Their army rule is for the greater good, basically the one where you have paired units both take aim at one enemy, and one of them gets guided for a +1 ballistic skill. Quite a strong rule, though it does have its downsides. It does rely on some units that are tasked for guiding, plus there's big negatives if you're splitting fire as well, and quite a lot of Tau units do kind of want to do that with small arms plus heavy weapons. The detachment rule is Cao Yon, which is interesting as it basically doesn't do much for you for the first couple of turns, and then gives you some pretty spectacular damage buffs to your shooting from turn 3 onwards. Particularly for guided units it is kind of immense, getting sustained hits too. Definitely going to make the army a little bit of a cagey one to play with. You definitely want to keep some strength back for that massive hit on turn 3. Though it is a bit of a problem in 40k missions where you do need to start getting stuck in early to score points. Otherwise, drones being war gear I think is generally a bit of a negative for the faction really. They'll be absorbing a lot less damage than they used to, and a lot of the units seem a lot more fragile. The suits being vehicles change is interesting as well, being able to fire in and out of combat. For standout rules and their supporting things, I feel like their Through Unity one is quite a nice focal damage buff, and the early Cao Yon one is really quite nice for a battlesuit commander perhaps. Getting sustained hits too, being a guided unit coming out of Deep Strike turn 2 seems absolutely excellent. For more standout units, I feel like Tau actually have a surprising amount of lone operatives on the board. They can have things like Ghost Kills, Shadow Sun, Sniper Drone Teams, and a few others. Shadow Sun certainly seems like one of the strongest datasheets in the Codex, giving you a nice aura of reroll ones to hit as well, really quite good on all that firepower. Otherwise, for dealing with tanks and armour, I feel like Piranhas are actually surprisingly savage with 2 free Seeker missiles at strength 14 now, and broadsides are probably going to be used quite a bit as well. They do seem, at least on paper, one of the stronger anti-tank choices. Crisis suits seem interesting but have got a lot more fragile without drones to tank from them. Mass cyclic ion blasters are interesting enough I suppose with a whole bunch of damage too, but you could actually be eating a surprising amount of damage due to overcharge. Despite the issues, I feel like Tau can still put a decent amount of pretty scary firepower together. Besides the jump shoot jump though, they just don't really seem to have all that many tricks, and do have the obvious weaknesses that they tend to always have, being fairly easy to kill in combat, and having to balance playing cagey and hiding shooting units compared with pushing forward and actually taking the centre and scoring points. I feel like they do have strength, but again maybe not too surprised to see them voted down kinda low like this. Moving on, we've got the pain-loving elves of the Drukhari. Their army rule is power from pain, generating pain tokens when they kill enemy units or make them fail battle shock, and then spending said tokens to allow you to reroll hits on key units or give them slight buffs to their movement. Real Space Raiders is kind of just more of that, giving you a few bonus pain tokens for taking the iconic characters. For datasheet things, they lost access to easy advance and charge, though still keep basically whole army invulnerable saves, often toned down to a 6+ though. They're still quite fast, but maybe not quite as charged from one deployment zone to the next as they were before. For their supporting rules, I kind of like the -1 wounds to Coven's units. The enhancement for extra pain tokens isn't too bad I guess, and Strike and Fade is always handy to shoot the unit but not get shot back. It is kind of weird that with the Drukhari datasheets that a bunch of the more efficient ones appear to be the lance-based shooting ones. In particular, the Ravager seems kind of stand out to me at 95 points. Strength 12, AP 3, and damage D6+2 is pretty scary for that kind of points cost, and they move very fast as well. The Void Ravens also seem kind of usable despite being flyers. They've got some big second wave strike potential there. A lot of their melee units these days though just seem a little bit on the underwhelming side of things, which is an incubi not being quite as good as they were before. I think hurts the faction quite a bit. And I feel like their faction mechanic in the first place is maybe a little bit snowbally. If you manage to get some enemy kills in early, then you'll get more pain tokens to do more damage. That should hopefully allow you to get some more kills. It might be a bit swingy depending on which armies you're facing as well. If you're playing against an enemy with loads of multiple small units, all well and good. If you're playing against Knights or Custodes or something, you're probably not going to get that many pain tokens. Overall definitely interesting, and the Lancefire Death Machine is pretty scary. I feel like a few of their combat units could probably use a little bit of help though. Next up, we've got the Angry Corn Marines of the World Eaters. Their army rule is the Blessing of Corn. Roll 8 dice and then choose 2 buffs from your board of choices. Berserkers can help you manipulate the dice rolls just a little bit. The buffs are all generally quite useful. I feel like some of the best though might be just the +2 move and advance and charge, which when combined can get your World Eaters into combat really quite quickly, often one of the biggest problems for them. The detachment is the Berserker Warband, give you +1 strength and +1 attack on the charge, the +1 attack being particularly nice. It also gives you a bunch of stratagems to help you support combat as well. I feel like the auto advance 6 one is particularly nice with the advance and charge blessing as well. That could give you one footbound unit just absolutely hurtle its way across the board and into combat. I feel like perhaps the single scariest thing about the World Eaters might be the opportunity for massive scouting. 8 bound can scout just innately now, so you could have 3 units of them, and potentially Lord Invocator scout up with 2 exalted 8 bound units as well. You could be having a seriously savage first turn charge, particularly if you get the +2 to move and the advance and charge thing. Otherwise for data sheets, I feel like the Berserkers are going to be useful for the objectives, partly just with the Blood Tithe. Khan and the Master of Executions both seem cheap enough to support them. Master of Executions gives you fight first as well, which is pretty intimidating. Angron perhaps seems a bit more so-so at 415 points, though still reviving him on a 666 is very scary. Again, it's just going to be far less reliable than it was. Otherwise, Land Raiders seem kind of usable, and the World Eater's Demon Prince could be fun for another melee machine. Overall, I would still say that the World Eaters are maybe a bit on the one-dimensional side. Not having as many shooting options is a little bit unhelpful. I guess they could use some Forge Fiends, Allied Brigands, or some Skull Cannons potentially. And I feel like while 8 bounds do have serious amounts of damage still, they're really not all that tough for the cost now. And the big scouting shenanigans that they have certainly has the opportunity to get screened out a bit by infiltrators. It'd be very sad if you had all this big scouting investment and then you just had to stay inside your deployment zone anyway. Definitely scary options, but also perhaps a little bit predictable and kind of easy to kill when you catch up with them. Next up, we've got the Adepta Sororitas. I feel like these girls have had a bit of a come down since their index preview. The Acts of Faith rule I think is perhaps stronger than ever, but they do have quite big problems with their data sheets and just don't really back it up with good stuff quite as well as say the Aeldari do. Acts of Faith allows you to generate miracle dice and then sub them into key rolls. Takes maybe a little bit of a time to get going, but you get one every single time you lose a unit. Plus the Battle Sister squads can generate them on objectives or with kills and things, and getting some guaranteed results is really nice. You can make some nice invulnerable saves and armor saves with smaller dice, and plug in big sixes to things like charge rolls or damage results with multi-melters. The detachment rule is Blood of the Martyrs, the one where you get a damage buff to injured units, a +1 to hits, then a +1 to wounds depending on how beaten up the squad is, and kinda nice that actually works with vehicles now. The data sheets haven't really been too kind to them I think though, having certain squads locked to 10 woman sister squads. The Battle Sisters and the Dominions I don't think have appreciated that very much. Plus I feel like the shorter range multi-melters has really hurt the faction by quite a lot. It's just not as reliable to use as anti-tank now. You might not be able to reach the enemy big threats with it, even if you move forward quite aggressively. Perhaps some of their better stratagems are to resurrect a character on death, and a +1 to wound on the charge, which seems quite nice with things like Zephyrim or Repentia. Their enhancements may be a little bit on the so-so side. There's a moderately expensive one that allows you to re-roll a miracle dice each turn. That could be quite nice for trying to turn some low ones into good ones. For more solid units in the faction, I feel like Sacrosanct with Astrid Thurger for some devastating wound melee seems very nice. The damage 2 maces do look quite nice with the mortal wounds, and I feel like you definitely could run multiple squads of those, using different buffing characters to make their melee better. Otherwise, the Exorcist I think is kind of fun for some reliable indirect fire with AP2 and damage D6, fairly scary stuff on that one. And I feel like at least you'd want some Battle Sister squads to farm miracle dice, probably some moving forward threats in Rhinos as well, seeing as they're quite nice transports and can get your melter actually in range of the enemy. I feel like using the miracle dice judiciously will get them so far, but perhaps they're still going to be a faction with more challenges than most. Lots of data sheets seem kind of fragile now, and I feel like Games Workshop maybe hasn't really adjusted points enough to anticipate the loss of the Bloody Rose melee buffs. Units like Repentia and Zephyrim just don't hit anywhere near as hard now, but haven't really gone down in points too much to compensate. Probably still one of the harder factions to play in the game right now. I feel like you just need to command them pretty carefully and only expose them to deal damage when it was most needed, while trying to manage your opponent getting into multi-melter range for you. Next up, and voted a bit higher, we have the Orks. The Greenskins in 10th edition seem to be just dealing out monumental amounts of violence, both their army rule and their detachment rule being heavily focused around combat. War is just a one-turn thing, giving them an invulnerable save, extra attacks and strength, and also advance and charge, and the War tribe also gives them sustained hits all game long. For their supporting rules in the index, I quite like their -1 to wound stratagem. The standard boys and beast snagger boys I think will really enjoy their 5+ armor saves as well. That certainly helps out with green tide type builds, particularly with less AP going around in 10th and more cover saves. I still feel like putting a huge amount of toughness 5 boys on the table will be a problem for some armies. You still can get quite a lot of them. Otherwise, for standout datasheets, at least a few Gretchens seem basically auto-include, very cheap objective control points and command point farming. Still feels like there's going to be an element of boys winning fights and the Grots winning games. The two Squigosaur datasheets, the Squigosaur boss and Mozrog Scragbad, both seem really quite mighty. They can be shot directly, but they can often just laugh off the damage with huge feel no pain type saves. Trucks seem pretty excellent for getting boys to the front. Only 50 points is very cheap for what they do now. And I do quite like the idea of a resurrecting Meganobs unit with a big mech. Certainly wasn't expecting the big mech in Mega Armor to basically function as an Orky Apothecary now. Help out the unit's durability with a custom force field while you put the injured boys back together. I think they maybe are still going to be an army that's a little bit focused around combat and certain aggressive units at the moment. Some of their shooting's okay though, the mech guns seem alright for the stats still, and flash kits are definitely a lot less terrible than they used to be at their points cost. Still though, 5+ ballistic skill is a bit hard to rely on given modifiers and things and the stealth rule cropping up from time to time, and basically none of their buffs really help shooting units all that much, so I feel like just about every Orky list is going to want at least a decent amount of melee to get the most out of War and the War tribe. One other potential weakness is that the War declaration has to be at the start of the battle round. It does mean that your opponent can see it coming very easily if they're going first. Might just give them a little bit more counterplay than you'd really want them to have in the best turn for your army in theory. Still though, certainly look like fun to play. Lots of greenskin violence, big advances and charges still, and a few very brutal and cunning datasheets. Next up, and voted the same as Orks, we have the Chaos Demons. Their army rule is the Shadow of Chaos, basically getting multiple debuffs, particularly to Battle Shock within the area of your control. Always your deployment zone, and then the mid-board as well if you can take at least half of the mid-board objectives. That one combines with their Warp Rift special rule, and that allows them a 6-inch deep strike next to enemy units if they do have some violent units that want to get into melee very easily, but that does have to be within the shadow. I feel like Demons are going to have to just scrap absolutely super hard for the mid-board objectives, something they will generally be doing anyway, but if they can't wrest at least half of them from the opponent each turn, then they're going to lose a whole bunch of their power, not being able to set up their units quite as well, and also missing out on those big buffs. Against some armies with just loads of objective control points on the centre board, that might not be very doable. Within their index, still basically the entire army gets invulnerable saves, which is quite nice. They're a bit more even in range and melee now, so not quite as susceptible to combat armies wiping them out. It does counter any armies that go a bit too heavy on big heavy guns with loads of AP. As well as their deep strike shenanigans, I do quite like the stratagem that allows them to deep strike just outside of 3 inches of enemies. That could be really quite a big deal for sneaky objectives and things, or just getting a shooting unit in a place where your opponent really doesn't want it. For their most standout units, I do feel that basically all the really big demons are perhaps the most exciting parts of the army. Be'lakor's absolutely excellent at just a bit over 300 points. His aura allows you to shield a good chunk of your army from shooting full stop, which is kind of massive with getting them into combat, particularly against gun lines. The Lord of Change with his psychic shooting attacks seem very good value for 230 points as well. He's also not the easiest to kill. Bloodthirsters are just massive anti-everything damage, which isn't really that common in 10th edition. Glad to see that they're still mighty. And Shalaxi Hellbane is kind of similar, though a little bit more expensive. Still a very, very scary datasheet that you really don't want to tangle with. I feel like perhaps a lot of lists are going to be a lot of the really big demons, just supported by a small supporting cast for doing things like objectives and scoring points. As for weaknesses, I do feel like a bunch of staple units compared with 9th edition just aren't quite as good as they used to be. Bloodletters and Fiends of Slanesh both feel a bit overcosted. Objective Control 0 is a bit depressing on Nurglings even if they're very cheap, and a lot of the others just maybe don't feel super standout for the cost for what they do. Still though, definitely not a bad army. I think it's going to be very spooky against some foes just to turn off shooting for a good chunk of their army for a turn, and a whole load of their monsters are just really quite hard to deal with and have some massive damage output when they get stuck in. Moving onwards and upwards, we have the normal humans holding the line against the Galaxy of Terrors with the Imperial Guard. Out of their own holy trinity of infantry, tanks and artillery, it does feel like the latest index really does skew the balance back towards artillery quite a lot, which has kind of taken a bit of a back seat in 9th edition. Their army special rule gives you orders, perhaps some of the most useful ones being the plus 3-inch move, a +1 to hit, and a +1 to your saving throw for infantry. The others all being fine or powerful though in the right situation. Their detachment rule is Born Soldiers, which was very powerful before. I do think it's a lot less so for a good chunk of the army, now you no longer get it if you move, but that's part of the reason that it's really helped artillery that didn't really want to move in the first place. I guess against certain armies that you need to punch up a bit against, like say Imperial Knights, you could focus a whole load more on standing still and just opening fire. Against more guerrilla armies, you can make use of more movement, as that might have more value. From their index rules, I feel like perhaps the single most outstanding thing is that reinforcement stratagem, which I think is going to get spammed about as maximally as it possibly can. Replenishing entire squads of sentinels, 20-man infantry squads, and all sorts of other things is just mad for 2 CP at a time. I think it's going to be very depressing when your opponent wipes out a big squad of 3 sentinels and they just trot back onto the board next turn, with 3 hunter-killer missiles reloaded of course. And there do seem to be a few things where you can stack various overlapping damage things together, particularly for artillery, say having Scout Sentinels spot for them. For more standout units at the moment, I do feel that Scout Sentinels are pretty amazing, very cheap, okay damage with hunter-killer missiles, good screening, marking targets, fairly tough, and then of course can be one of the best targets for that respawn stratagem. Kind of hard to go too far wrong with that little lot. Lord Solar Leontus and Castellan Creed are pretty excellent command point and order generators. Lord Solar farms CP, Creed hands out free stratagems, and they both have 5 orders between them. Some combination of Basilisks and Manticores perhaps feel like the most useful use of your indirect fire buffs. Manticores perhaps a little bit more raw damage with their damage 3, but Basilisks slowing down certain units is very nice. I do think that 20 strong infantry squads with durability boosts will probably be making their presence felt on midfield objectives. You can definitely get a whole load of objective control points there, and again a decent choice for recycling with reinforcements. In terms of problems for the guard, they do remain somewhat slow. I certainly feel with the reduced version of move, you're not going to be getting around the table quite as fast, and even with quite a lot of raw stats on the board, they're not too hard to kill with the lack of invulnerable saves, and the infantry squad certainly won't like getting shot by any sort of blast weapon, which will rinse them pretty quickly when they're ranked up. Things with widespread use of can't be shot out of 12 inches are going to be super painful for them as well. You certainly can't just artillery damage things off the board if you can't even shoot them at all. Still though, really quite interesting and strong, lots of raw power on the datasheets, and in particular scary artillery. Some of the Rust variants do seem really quite cool as well, perhaps particularly the scary demolishers with strength 14 and a whole bunch of shots. Next up we've got the Bugs from Beyond with the Tyranids, the poster child antagonist faction of 10th edition, and their army rules are Synapse and Shadow in the Warp, basically playing around with Battle Shock and leadership quite a lot. Shadow in the Warp makes the entire enemy army test Battle Shock. Sometimes it could be useful, but it just seems kind of scattergun with how much use it is, plus certain armies have various ways of mitigating it, at least to a little extent. It is just one turn though, and a bit on the unreliable side, definitely not inconceivable that it could do absolutely nothing. I think their detachment rule is maybe a bit more reliably powerful though. The adaptive rule allows you to tailor a damage buff either against tanks, infantry, or characters. Really quite handy, particularly if your opponent has skewed all to one side of that. Very nice against knights or 100% infantry armies, a bit less so against mixed forces. For their stratagems and supporting rules, I feel like one of the best value ones might be their Endless Swarm one, provided your termagants are alive to trigger it. If your opponent messes up their damage output a bit and leaves a couple of Tyranid termagant squads depleted, then 2d3 plus 6 termagants respawned for 1 CP is kind of massive. For the enhancements, I do quite like the 5 plus Feel No Pain type one as well. That seems very nice for a Hive Tyrant, particularly if it goes up to a 4 plus if they get injured. The Tyranids do have really quite a lot of options, and it sounds like more on the way with their codex. For perhaps most standout datasheets though, I feel like the Barb Gaunts are kind of ridiculous at just 50 points for a unit of 5 of them. Their anti-infantry damage output at 50 points is just genuinely great for that kind of cost, but far more importantly they can just be a massive debuff to infantry armies, slowing them all down with their move advances and charges, which is absolutely huge. A trio of individual Biovores handing out some spore mines into the midfield is pretty massive as well. They have that rule where you can't advance if you approach near them, and again that could just massively slow the enemy getting to the midfield objectives and bringing their force to bear. Otherwise, for its direct damage dealers, they've got plenty of interesting options. I feel like the Haruspex is looking great for 125 points, and the Zoanthropes too at just 90 points for 3 of them with those pretty terrifying lances. Again, maybe like the Tower, I feel like they're an army that's got quite a lot of just raw, genuinely fairly good things, but perhaps not quite as many big buffing tricks or really massive power moves that they can make, at least compared with a few of the other armies. A fair few of their armies have a bit of underwhelming AP and kind of low damage as well. You might need to make a small conscious effort to make sure you're building in at least a decent amount of anti-tank into your list, perhaps. Overall, definitely seem kind of solid enough. in a fairly good place going into 10th. Lastly, for Tier 3, we've got Blood Angels, who are right on the top end by your vote. Anyway, I was kind of surprised that people were a lot kinder to the Blood Angels compared with the Space Wolves. I don't know if it literally is just due to the Death Company datasheet, which does seem very, very nice. Though I suppose their Sons of Sanguinius detachment is a bit more reliably good compared with those unreliable sagas. The Sons of Sanguinius detachment gives you +1 strength and +1 attack on the charge. Very nice straightforward melee damage there. The strength may be a little bit on the situational side, but attacks genuinely will help out most units quite a lot. Basically, if Space Marine melee was good, it's generally a little bit more dangerous with this. Does feel like a bit of a trade-off with the Gladius though, with the easy access to advance and charge from that. Otherwise, they have a few useful melee support stratagems, and I feel like in particular Red Rampage feels quite nice, as a pretty strong damage buff with the lance attacks. For the datasheets, while it might have been Sanguinary Guard carrying the codex throughout much of 8th and 9th edition, Death Company perhaps seem to be the most exciting thing out of the Blood Angels these days. 31 points per model, and you can give them all Thunderhammers should you wish to. Quite nice to have access to an Astartes jump unit with actual damage 2 weapons on it, and they've got some pretty solid supporting rules, in particular Lamates looks quite nice for leading them, maybe Astarath. I do feel that Sanguinary Guard are probably a bit too much to justify for the most part though, at 43 points. It's just massively higher than it used to be. I think they could use at least a 5-point discount on that. Overall though, it does seem that people have Blood Angels and Space Wolves rated as the slightly weaker Space Marine sub-factions though, a bit below Dark Angels, Deathwatch and Black Templars for raw Astartes power. Speaking of which though, let's move onwards and upwards into the Tier 2 armies. These are looking like genuinely very strong 40k armies in 10th edition. Here we have Chaos Space Marines, Grey Knights, Chaos Knights, Genestealer Cults, Deathwatch, Black Templars, Thousand Suns, and Dark Angels. Really quite a lot of power armor in this one. First up, and realistically only slightly ahead of the Blood Angels, at least in the voting, are the Chaos Space Marines. In 10th edition, these guys get their Dark Pacts, either getting sustained or lethal hits every time they attack if they want to, though you do risk taking some damage for that, with some surprise mortal wounds if you fail leadership. In reality, the vast majority of the time it's going to be even better than that. The Marks of Chaos allow you to get better packs, either getting those mortals or lethals off on a 5+, or rerolls with Undivided. The Gods and Undivided also have boosted versions of stratagems as well. Really does allow a little bit more deep customization of individual units, perhaps more so than other armies in 40k get. I feel like for individual powerful rules in the index there's really quite a lot going on. You could be getting a 5+ Feel No Pain Demon Prince with the Slanesh upgrade, also handing out a few Battle Shock tests as well. The Mark of Nurgle alongside Dark Obscuration can stop your unit getting shot at greater than 12 inches. That could be really quite massive alongside either a ranked up Terminator or Possessed squad. Really quite frustrating to have a massive melee threat just not be able to get shot by your opponent at all. Really quite a lot of choice with allies. They can have basically any demon datasheet or any knight datasheet, plus even borrow Cult Marines from the other 3 Chaos Space Marine codexes. And I feel like the Chaos Undivided stratagem for 4 rerolls to hit and wound on one of your attacks is absolutely crazy for 1 CP. Particularly massive on anything that's got access to devastating wounds, things like Possessed or the Forge Fiend perhaps. Otherwise, besides things already mentioned, I feel like Noise Marines seem very undercosted at only 85 points for some reason. No idea why they're that cheap when they still have some kind of interesting gear, not quite as strong as they were, but if you're going to cost them at 17 points per model including things like Blastmasters, that seems absolutely great. Possessed and Terminators seem like really quite nice focal units for leaders and buffing up with the stratagems. Obliterators might also join Forge Fiends for decent fire support, fairly cheap at 80 points each now. And Accursed Cultists seem like they could be just all round strong when buffed. You do get a lot of them and they regenerate. Abaddon could even give them a 4+ invulnerable save as well with his rule, which does seem kind of massive on a unit that doesn't really get any big saves normally. Overall, I do feel like they're really quite a solid army. Definitely getting to be a much more of a strong faction in Warhammer 40k, as with the rest of those ones at this kind of level. I feel like they do have some strong datasheets and some kind of dud ones though. Their dark packs can also be a bit punishing if you just get a few bad rolls as well. Definitely some games you might just be rolling a bunch of past leaderships and take no mortal wounds, and some games you might have a whole bunch of Space Marines just casually sacrificed to the Dark Gods. Next up, and also looking very solid in current 40k, are Grey Knights. Grey Knights certainly had their teleport tricks in 9th edition, but it's just been ramped up to a whole extra level in 10th. Seems like both their detachment rule, their army rule, and their stratagems tend to revolve around teleporting around the board. You can't really outdistance the Knights of Titan. Their main rule, Teleport Assault, basically takes your units off the board at the end of the enemy turn, puts them back into strategic reserve, and then deep strikes them back down in your reinforcement phase. Really quite powerful for getting alpha strikes and catching up with your opponents. Against some armies with very good board control and good screening though, it might not be quite as good as it looks on paper. The detachment rule gives you teleport shunt, so an auto advance 6 inches. I feel like that's perhaps most useful for the advance and shoot stratagem, where you've got a 1 CP 1 to advance and fire as if your weapons had assault, and also get +1 to hit. Otherwise though, their stratagems and supporting rules just really double down on the teleport shenanigans. There's a 1 command point 1 to make a Grey Knight unit less than 9 inches of an enemy to either move or return to reserves, both absolutely massive for keeping your units safe that are just about to get killed, and the Sigil of Exigence still gives you a once per game redeploy when your unit gets shot. 2 more pretty enormous ways to keep your units safe from harm there, and then deliver them back into the fray next turn. Overall, I feel like the Grey Knights perhaps have a lot of their power skewed towards their army rules as opposed to in their datasheets. They definitely went up in points a fair bit, probably most likely paying for the sheer power of their army rules. With all this deep striking out of 9 inches, I feel like perhaps the shooting units might have a little bit more superiority over some of the combat ones. Things like Purgation Squads or Dread Knight firepower seem nice. Incinerators are a lot more relevant in 10th edition as well, with Overwatch being such a big thing. Though just about every unit having fairly good quality damage to melee certainly doesn't hurt when they need to get stuck in. In general, I kind of feel like Grey Knights might have to play a little bit like how Genestealer Cults played last edition, their datasheets perhaps being a little bit overcosted compared with what they'd really do if they were just walking up the board, so do need to absolutely capitalise on the alpha strikes and really hit the enemy hard when it counts, and make use of their sneaky tricks to save their units or terrain to keep their models safe after they've done the damage. Next up, we've got Battleshock the Army with the Chaos Knights. Their big tanky knight stat lines certainly bring a massive amount of raw power to the game. Somehow they've combined going down in cost quite a lot compared with previous, with a whole load of extra raw power on their guns. Things like the Despoiler with dual Gatling cannons or dual rapid-fire battle cannons seem utterly terrifying. The War Dog Brigands and the Stalkers also seem really quite efficient for their part. You can get a whole load of fairly scary vehicles on the board, pretty capable at both range and melee. Their army rule is Harbingers of Dread, basically a big leadership debuff within 12 inches, and then from turn 3 they go into damage mode as well. You get a +1 to wound against battle-shocked units from turn 3 onwards, and they struggle to hit you quite as hard back. Leadership and battle shock is kind of big in 10th edition, though I feel like their main core boost of this with the damage and defense maybe comes just a little bit on the late side. With a bunch of towering models that are going to be engaging the foe right from the start, the game might be solidly going one way or the other by turn 3 I feel. Otherwise, their detachment rule really doubles down on making Battle Shock happen more. Forged in Terror gives you a 12-inch aura of making enemy units test Battle Shock even if they've been depleted slightly. And I feel like out of all of the armies in Warhammer 40k, this feels like one of the very best to actually make Battle Shock meaningful. The ones that really matter are the ones that are actually failed in the opponent's Battle Shock phase as opposed to handed out by other units at random, as it could stop them scoring objectives or falling back from your vengeful knights. Otherwise, for solid supporting rules, there's an enhancement that can make enemy weapons a worse AP against them, very nice for AP1 or AP2. There's one that can give you Doom and Despair from turn 1, so hopefully debuff enemy battle shock units and then get boost against them nice and early. There's a strat for moving straight through terrain, which can often be a problem for knights, the 4+ invulnerable save, and the interesting towering rules that both allow you to shoot and be shot early in the game, basically ignoring the whole line of sight blocking thing of ruins. So if you've got ruins with windows on the board that you're playing with, big knights are both going to be pretty much unhideable, but you can't really hide from them either. Just in general, their sheer raw toughness of knight armies, with the inflated toughness values of 10th edition and less small arms being able to hurt them, I think it's really going to be quite a big deal. Quite a lot of units that might have comfortably taken down a War Dog or an Abhorrent Knight might struggle to do so now. Chaos Knights also get some allied demons as well. They could be very helpful to jump on objectives and things and give you some presence around the board. Overall, at least the initial impressions of the internet seem to think that Chaos Knights are probably coming off a little bit rough compared with the Imperial Knights decks. Perhaps similarly to previously, the Chaos Knights really seem to play around Battle Shock, leadership and fancy things like that, where the Imperial Knights just go for mass raw damage and defense. The Battle Shock things are good, but might be overkill, and some armies have interesting defenses against it, which might make it a lot less useful. And I guess just in general for knights, you might have the option of hard counters that you could run into. If any army goes ridiculously hard on anti-tank, there might not be that much that you can do to stop them taking down your hard targets. Still though, I feel like knights in general, both Chaos and Imperial, are in really quite a good place in 10th. Moving on, we've got the Genestealer Cult, definitely one of the more interesting and spooky armies to play in 10th edition, with so many respawning models. Their army rule is Cold Ambush, basically a mechanic to recycle their units, respawning models on a 4+, or basically always respawning the models if they're battle line. You put down a token and your opponent needs to try and reach that token and delete it off the board. If they can't reach them, then another big horde of your units come back. In some games it means that your opponent might have to kill the same model several times over. The detachment rule is the Ascension Day one. They came from below, gives you sustained hits 1 and ignores cover when you come out from reserve. Really quite powerful and does appear to affect the units that came on from Cold Ambush as well. A nice damage boost when your units get the jump on the enemy. Otherwise, for supporting options in the index, I quite like their one where they get to basically copy the Grey Knights rule and redeploy units at the end of the enemy turn, putting them into Deep Strike and coming down in your own reserves phase. They do have another one of those arrive just outside of 3 inches stratagems, which could be making them hard to screen for things like fragile units with shooting, or just getting your units to places where they need to do those secondary objectives. They've also got a couple of nice enhancements that can mess with command points, generally tend to be at least somewhat high yield ones. Otherwise, just loads of units having Deep Strike is pretty great for objectives for the most part. You can definitely get the bodies where they're needed, and you could ally in some cheap guard for some indirect fire if you'd like, just doubly making sure that your opponent can't hide from you, and you can double down the pressure on where it's most needed. Again, perhaps maybe a faction that gets more of their power from their powerful army rules as opposed to any individual datasheets. Neophyte hybrids do seem pretty excellent though, with the respawning rules, lots of objective control points, and they can get the sustained hits 1 out of Deep Strike, and then come back in a big way with some range pressure to hit the enemy. And of course there's all sorts of more melee focused units as well. A lot of the characters do seem like really good value as well. The Kelemorph Sanctus and Reductus Saboteur are all super cheap, a lot of individual annoying threats that your opponent might struggle to deal with, and I feel like the Patriarch is actually very interesting now he's down to just 85 points. At that kind of points cost is interesting just in terms of his raw combat stats, never mind anything else. Probably the single biggest weaknesses for them are very fast moving units countering cold ambush tokens very well. I feel like they're an army where they're just going to basically overwhelm certain slow moving factions with just an endless tide of bodies, but very fast moving ones might just delete the cold ambush or force them to deploy so far back they're kind of meaningless. A few of the battle line units and things do feel a little bit on the pricey side, probably partly due to that respawn mechanic being built in though. Overall some very cool faction rules. I do quite like Games Workshop's new reinterpretation of the Uprising, the cult of the four-armed emperor rising up to drag down their foes once again. Moving on, we've got some more loyalist Space Marines in the Deathwatch, rated a bit higher than the Blood Angel or Space Wolf counterparts by you guys. I think perhaps just because they a little bit more obviously play into the main Space Marine buffs, being a bit more of a range-focused faction that kind of doubles down on Oath of Moment and all the double-down damage buffs that Space Marines can bring. The detachment rule is mission tactics, 3 turns worth of really quite useful damage boosts, either lethal hits, sustained hits, or precision hits. Really quite guaranteed extra utility there on the turns that matter the most. Their index rules have a whole load of rules to amp up their shooting as well, with the various different types of special issue ammunition. They're kind of weird that they can apply to basically any Space Marine shooting unit. It does give you quite a lot of options with making their firepower more dangerous. They do have some teleportarium shenanigans as well, which is always nice to have for a bit of redeployment and hitting the enemy where they least expect. For their actual datasheets, I feel like their characters in the Corvus Blackstar maybe aren't enormously outstanding, not unusable but probably overshadowed by the majority of the other Space Marine options. In terms of actual unique units, I feel like a couple of the 10 strong kill teams could be quite nice. They do get very efficient stratagem use, and it seems to be far more efficient to take the kill teams in 10-man squads rather than 5, as that's when you get all the exciting unit upgrades. The Proteus kill team with a bunch of Terminators maybe seems kind of fun. The Primaris one's interesting as well. In general though, I feel like they'll do pretty well with the standard Space Marine shooting type units, things like Desolation Squads and Whirlwinds, and quite a few others that we'll get onto in the actual Space Marine section. Overall seem like a solid alternative way to play Space Marines to me. Probably for the best that Games Workshop tones down that fairly broken Devastating Wounds combo with anti-infantry Hellfire rounds though. Definitely wasn't a good thing for the game that they could potentially table entire infantry armies in one round with 1 CP. Moving on, we have the other Black Armoured Space Marines in the Black Templars, ranked very similarly by you guys, and again having all the strong Space Marine datasheets to play with, plus Oath of Moment, their own detachment giving them some Templar vows instead of the various movement shenanigans of the Gladius. Out of the Templar vows, they do have some nice combat ones, but I feel like the 6+ Feel No Pain type one is perhaps the most interesting. Really quite good army-wide durability, and allows you to get 1 squad with a 5+ Feel No Pain with an enhancement, and 1 boosted form of a stratagem as well. Currently they almost feel like the Iron Hands, in which they can basically be just Space Marines but tougher if you're willing to pass up the Gladius. Out of their stratagems, they've got lots of useful ones, and maybe feel like the 4+ chance to prevent enemies falling back though is one of the most interesting and unique. There's not a lot of units in the game with that kind of ability at the moment, and being able to lock things in combat with scary melee stuff is pretty nice. For their unique units, I feel like perhaps the Crusader squad is the single most standout datasheet. Very cheap marine bodies to put on the board with a whole bunch of volume attacks, plus they can scout forward to get a whole bunch of objective control points on the centre objectives too. Their unique character datasheets all seem to be sufficiently costed to be worth their abilities as well. Helbrecht, Grimoldus and the Emperor's Champion I think all look interesting, particularly Grimoldus maybe with his choice of buffs. Overall seem very solid. Space Marines are very good just in their own right. These guys can basically be Space Marines but more durable, or trade out for a combat boost if it makes more sense for your matchup. I guess perhaps the biggest issue is competing with the Gladius style shooting Marines, and some vehicles are locked into taking multi-melters when they might not necessarily want to. It's not the worst option to have, but to be forced to pay basically 15 points extra might not necessarily always be worth it. Next up, and getting right towards the top of the tier 2 strong armies now, we've got Thousand Sons. Their army rule, Cabal of Sorcerers, doesn't help out your entire army, but just gives you a few really powerful boosts every turn. Your units generate Cabal points, then you spend them on 5 different very powerful spells. I think all of them are excellent, whether it's mass mortal wounds from Doombolt, double moving and shooting, just flat out cancelling one failed save per turn just for 2 Cabal points, but perhaps the biggest one is just removing armor saves from a unit, which seems absolutely crazily powerful even if it costs a lot. With that plus the fairly decent volume fire that the Thousand Sons can get with psychic weapons, they can basically just remove entire units from the board regardless of what they are. It's really going to punish certain armies with an emphasis on big tough units with high saves. Kindred Sorcery can help out their psychic attacks. There's definitely a fair few of those flying around just from the sorcerers in general, but can be kind of helpful for that psychic combi bolters option for 1 command point. Make your Scarab Occult Terminators fire with psychic weapons and +1 strength for 1 CP, and a few of the other buffs from sorcerers and other stratagems can make that even scarier. Otherwise, a bunch of their datasheets retain 5+ invulnerable saves. Things like their vehicles and Rubric Marines are a bit harder to remove with things like melter weapons due to that, and I quite like the way that they've retained that Umbralific Crystal as well, teleporting a big squad into a dangerous position to unleash all that damage. Just in general, a whole bunch of their units feel very efficient now. Scarab Occult Terminators to build big damage combos around and support with characters. Rubric Marines seem very strong at just 95 points with a free Soul Reaper cannon built in. They're the ones that are going to be able to be joined by most characters as well, so are very relevant. Mutalith Vortex Beasts can put out some frighteningly powerful anti-tank shooting, plus big mortal wounds, very nice for what they do now. And Magnus looks utterly devastating for his points cost. Absolutely massive psychic threat in the shooting phase, and amps up psychic damage with his auras, plus his combat is certainly no slouch either. Definitely a far cry from where he was in 9th edition, particularly as he can hide in behind terrain now. Just in general, quite a lot of the sorcerers are really quite efficient. Ahriman's maybe not the most interesting datasheet in the world, but with a +1 to wound and a free Kabbalistic ritual, I think he still provides value. In general, still might have some issues with being somewhat short-ranged and kind of slow outside of their special buffs, but I feel like they're an army with a whole ton of raw damage and defense when they leverage their tricks. Finally, and voted highest by you guys out of these tier 2 armies, we've got the Dark Angels. Out of the Divergent chapters, these were ranked highest out of any of them, though it does seem that just core Codex Space Marines and the focus on the Gladius formations seems to be the initial army to beat, at least by people's first impressions. Again, as before with everything, massive damage with Oath of Moment, great Space Marine datasheets, though beyond that I feel like the majority of their strength is probably coming from their unique datasheets as opposed to their detachment rule. Grim Resolve just feels very underwhelming for me. It's the one that gives you a bit of insurance against one aspect of Battle Shock, going down to 1 OC if you fail it. I think this one's just kind of niche as to whether it's ever actually going to have any impact on the game. Though the detachment does have a few other interesting things, such as a return fire stratagem when you're shot, and particularly a -1 damage in melee, which seems very nice for Terminators. In general, I think their datasheets are maybe the more exciting bit, perhaps particularly Lionel Johnson, who really is very mighty indeed now. He's learned how to use the Emperor's Shield since 9th edition it would seem, a 3+ invulnerable save, -1 to wound, lone operative when he's nearby some sort of screening unit, and if you decide to charge him, he's going to hit you first with a monstrous amount of close combat attacks, as he has the fight's first special rule. Otherwise, I think that the Deathwing Terminator Command Squad is well worth the upgrade over the standard version. Resurrecting a Terminator per turn, extra objective control, and champion buffs like +1 to advance and charge all seem great. For the other datasheets in the Codex, a lot of the characters are really quite cheap. Maybe Azrael I think is one of the very best though. A 4+ invulnerable save, decent enough melee stats, and giving units sustained hits just seems like an overall great package, as well as generating command points as well. I think it'd be weird not to include him in just about every Dark Angel's army, really. Overall, for the Dark Angels, I kind of feel like their datasheets are just quite a lot stronger than their actual detachment. Maybe it might be better served in the Gladius, perhaps. They definitely bring a lot of raw power, though. Certainly feel like, to some extent, Space Marines, but with some extra cool stuff. Next up, we get into Tier 1, some of the very, very strong Warhammer 40k armies now. I feel like these might be factions to beat in 10th edition. I might have saved one for a very last final tier after this, but perhaps some of the biggest threats in 10th edition at the moment are Space Marines, Adeptus Custodes, Imperial Knights, and Necrons. Starting out, we've got the Adeptus Custodes, which maybe not too dissimilarly from 9th edition, are just bringing absolutely raw massive stats. Loads of units with their 2+ saves, their 4+ invulnerable saves, and quality melee with damage 2. I feel like in particular all their damage 2 attacks are going to quite like 10th edition more than 9th, as they're not countered quite so often by a whole load of units with -1 damage. They still certainly exist, but just maybe aren't quite as common across entire armies as they were. The Custodes army special rule is Martial Guitar. That gives them their choice of one of 3 different melee boosts when it gets to the fight phase. Kinda nice to see which fights you're in before you get to select them as well. Lethal hits in particular could be quite nice to punch up against heavy hitters like Knights. Agents of the Emperor, their detachment special rule is maybe a bit more niche, a 4+ save against mortal wounds, maybe not quite as common to be absolutely spammed in 10th edition, but it certainly helps out against one of the best damage output types that will absolutely go through high saves, toughness, and imbuls. Otherwise, for their detachment though, I feel like their supporting rules are just very, very strong indeed. In particular, they can get a fight first stratagem when they're on objectives, and that just means with big scary Custodes units you just really can't afford to charge them with certain things, as otherwise they're just going to get killed before they even get to strike. There's another really reliable one to resurrect a Custodian. Bringing something like 50 or 60 points worth of Custodes might back to the board every turn for 1 CP is pretty great, and could give you some positioning shenanigans as well. They've got 1/4+1 to wound against monsters as well, again which is very nice with Guardian Spears trying to punch up against tough stuff. For the standout units, I maybe feel like the majority of Custodes armies might go quite heavy on Custodian Guard initially. Seems like the Guardian Spears are probably the way to go for them. 5 attacks with strength 7 and damage 2 is just awesome for 45 points. They get big rerolls if they're on objectives, which is absolutely massive, and even their shooting can be surprisingly brutal with a whole bunch of damage to auric weapon fire that can double fire once per game. Maybe a shield captain or a blade champion to lead them perhaps. Either 3 stratagems or really quite a long melee charge threat is quite nice on either of those. The bikes and the Terminators both seem fine. I do quite like the way that Sister of Silence can be fielded in 4-woman units now. Kinda nice for screening and objective holding, so a few of those for utility could be kind of good. At the moment we've got the Forge World points but not the full data sheets yet, besides a few leaks. At the moment the Caladius and the Achilles are looking really quite promising for the amount of points and the amount of damage they do. Looks like the Caladius tanks are going to be pretty solid firepower for their 215 points. Otherwise, perhaps in terms of main weaknesses, they don't really have that much shooting outside of Forge World, just a bunch of Guardian Spear shots. They're not really going to be clearing most tanks at range, and even with their good defensive stat lines, certain damage profiles will still kill them surprisingly easily with flat damage 3 and AP 2. And quite a lot of armies are rather good at killing just really big tough single units, say for example Marines with their Oath of Moment and plenty of others. Overall definitely seems like they're remaining a very, very strong army in 10th edition though, and bringing a massive amount of raw might. Next up, we've got the Necrons just reanimating their way to victory with awesome regeneration mechanics, even if the core reanimation protocols rule is a little bit lackluster if it didn't have any buffs. Usually it just means that you either repair or revive D3 wounds to a unit one after another, each in the command phase. Certainly not awful to have your squads regrow over time, but in theory it could mean that there's some decent counters with just focusing down each unit in turn. In reality though, it seems as though with all the datasheets revealed that they can stack just a fairly ridiculous amount of reanimation protocols. They've got a stratagem to trigger its reactive to enemy attacks. The Ghost Art can restore some models to Necron warrior squads and things. The Canoptic Reanimator, if it's nearby, can add an extra D3 to each reanimation protocols that happens, so provided you can keep that safe, then that's absolutely massive. Resurrection Orbs can activate it in both command phases, and then there's just flat durability boosts for the warriors that make the entire thing more efficient. Say things like a 5+ feel no pain from a Technomancer, or a -1 to hit from the Chronomancer. Pull that all together, and if you've got a supported Necron warrior squad, or maybe Lich Guard, you could just have a crazy amount of models just standing back up and returning to life, even after the opponent has wiped out most of the units. The Necron launch detachment really does seem big on squads like this being led by characters as well. Command protocols giving you a +1 to hit, just doubling down on characters already being fairly efficient for the faction. In terms of choice of leaders, I feel like really quite a lot of them are fairly solid. The Cryptex seem really nice at the very cheap points cost that they have. I do like the standard Overlord as well for the free stratagems, 85 points for that seems great. And Anrakir the Traveller seems particularly nice for his damage boost, giving a unit +1 to wound makes them just so much more threatening. Otherwise in the army, the Veil of Darkness is nice for jumping a squad around the board, maybe getting some Gauss Reapers in range potentially. They've got a stratagem for re-rolling wounds at range, which seems kinda brutal, combined with maybe Ironrick here, and they've got plenty of other solid datasheets as well. That Transcendent Catan can take a 4+ Feel No Pain enhancement, which seems like a rather nice combo together, and a few solid options for anti-tank as well, Locust Destroyers for infantry, and Heavy Destroyers for anti-armor. Overall, just in general, they seem incredibly strong. Necron warrior units that you might just deal a whole load of damage to and then just bounce off, stomping slowly onto the midfield objectives and hopefully taking them against all comers. As for downsides, I'd say they're maybe not one of the biggest damage dealing armies in the game, definitely more focused on durability as you might expect for Necrons, slowly grinding you down with a whole bunch of lethal hits Gauss shots. Next up, and when the Chaos Knights mess around with battle shock type things, seems like the Imperial Knights just go all in for massive damage and defense, really putting the boosted knightly war gear to work in fairly spectacular fashion. Again, they're an army of massive super heavy walkers that's going to be a problem in itself for lots of armies with a bunch of small arms. Toughness 12 just isn't going to care against many attacks, and I must admit their data sheets are costed lower than might have expected for the Knights faction. Their army ability is the Code Chivalric, really quite a nice damage buff with rerolling some 1s, or a movement boost with +1 to advance and charge. Both of those have a deed in which you gain 3 command points for either slaying the enemy warlord or holding their home objective for a turn. Kind of unlikely to happen, but if it happens you get 3 CP, and also boost to certain stratagems and their base Feel No Pain. Their detachment rule gives them a 6+ Feel No Pain, definitely pretty excellent for knights where often they're just going to be out in the open exposed to enemy shooting. Often their survivability might matter more than their damage output as they're going to take the brunt of enemy attacks. As well as all that, they also get bondsman abilities. In general, it seems that Imperial Knights are going to be most optimal with one big knight paired with one little knight, as if you have enough to pair them all off, they get some absolutely massive buffs to both units, dependent on the datasheet of the big Questoris Knights. Again, like the Chaos Knights, they've just got staggering amounts of raw shooting. Things like those 18-shot Avenger Gatling cannons. They can potentially hit you behind obscuring terrain due to the towering keyword. They seem just monstrously scary. Absolutely excellent stratagems like Fight on Death for 1 CP, devastating wounds in melee for 1 command point, and a +1 to wound at shooting stratagem for 1 CP, with the proviso that if you don't kill the unit, then you can't use the stratagem again. But even for a 1-use punch, that is absolutely huge. They've got enormous overwatch potential, being enormous units in themselves, could just delete enemy units in your turn if you get lucky and roll a few 6s, and a lot of their units like the Chaos Knights as well have got very high objective control points. You're going to need entire squads of troops to even take objectives off a standard armiger. I think most of their datasheets do seem pretty solid, maybe a few of the standout Questoris could be the Warden with the -1 damage and the 18-shot devastating wound Gatling cannon, rather a brutal combo there. The Night Crusaders seem pretty excellent with 2 of the enormous scary ranged guns plus a free top gun and -1 to hit when they combine with an armiger. I feel like Canis Rex is just crazily good value at 405 points, perhaps a particularly interesting one to ally as well as he isn't really dependent on armigers for his abilities. I feel like the armigers themselves maybe aren't the most exciting bit of the army, perhaps just necessary to activate those awesome Questoris buffs, but the Warglaive in particular I think is a very strong datasheet, and in general you're probably going to want about as many armigers as you have Questoris Knights, just so they're operating at peak efficiency. Overall just seem like absolutely crazily scary amounts of damage and defense. Unless your opponent has some serious anti-tank power, then they're going to really struggle against these. Even with things like mass lethal hits and devastating wounds running around, I feel like the Knights will do absolutely fine. I guess any army that can skew into enormous anti-tank will probably give them problems. They might have some issues with moving around terrain, but just overall I still think they're going to be an army to beat, enormous units and stats here. Finally, for the Tier 1 armies, before we get on to our bonus mention, we have the Space Marines. We have mentioned a bunch of their rules several times over with the various divergent chapters, but it seems that the majority of people seem to think that the raw strength of the Codex is coming from Codex Space Marines itself, rather than the add-ins given by Dark Angels or Blood Angels or the rest. Oath of Moment, as I mentioned, is absolutely awesome, Definitely seems to be one of the tools that you could use to deal some crazy damage to a massive Custodes unit or an Imperial Knight. Rerolling all hits and wounds just makes just about any gun in your army fairly efficient against them. Perhaps particularly nice for things like Hellblasters with a whole bunch of Strength 8 damage 2 shots. That does seem rather good. For their detachment, they get the Gladius with the combat doctrines, 3 different move and damage rules, whether it's advance and charge, advance and shoot, or fallback, shoot and charge if that makes more sense. Means that assault units can get a pretty hefty threat range, and in the early game you won't have too much trouble getting range and line of sight on things. They do have some strong stratagems to flex into the doctrines, plus the lance rule for assault doctrine melee units. Out of the enhancements, maybe the bolted discipline one might be one of the best ones, if you compare that with good firepower units with leaders joining squads. Critical hits on a 5+ with things like lethal hits thrown in could be kind of nasty. The Space Marines have access to an absolutely massive amount of datasheets. I feel like that might be more relevant than ever given that so much of the datasheet power tends to be on their special rules. I feel like things like Incursors giving you +1 to hit against one unit, or the Storm Speeder Hailstrike giving you an extra AP -1 against one unit, both of those are awesome for focusing firepower. You could either combine that with the Oath of Moment target, or target something different. Space Marines certainly seem to have one of the best ignores line of sight firepower things in the game. Desolation Squads and Whirlwinds for enormous indirect fire, again combined with Oath potentially, and they can get numerous other buffs. I feel like the Desolation Squads in particular are just massively undercosted at 120 points, utterly enormous damage characteristics from their crack missiles, never mind all the out of line of sight stuff they can get, particularly that Bengal launcher. Otherwise, they've got loads of other interesting things. Repulsors are just generally cheap, clocking in at under a Adepta Dreadnought now, which is pretty crazy. They've got that re-embark move as well when enemy units threaten them to charge. For more direct firepower, the Hellblasters and the Gladiator Lancer both look kind of cool. Gilliman himself is pretty massive, declaring a second Oath of Moment target, and just his raw combat stats are pretty big. And I feel like you probably want at least one Space Marine captain somewhere in the list handing out free stratagems to a big unit, and Librarians with a 4+ invulnerable save look good for your most threatening squads as well. Overall, Space Marines certainly look like they're bringing an enormous amount of damage to the game. I feel like perhaps their biggest issues though might be the defense that they have in return. Lots of armies have a lot of shots that deal AP -1 or AP2 damage to shooting, and that goes through Space Marines fairly well. I wouldn't be too surprised if certain units like the Desolation Squads do get some sort of points balance update in the future though. Finally, and just above tier 1, and probably not too much of a surprise to most people, is the Fated for Balance changes tier, and the ridiculous, massive, awesome power of the Aeldari. I must admit, as soon as people saw their index rules for the Eldar, a lot of people seemed to think that they just had the strongest core rules out of just about any preview so far. Massive damage boosts or defensive boosts available, either with Strands of Fate and flat damage rerolls for every single unit attacking. I think that was always going to mean that they were going to be an army that was very strong unless Games Workshop put their points cost up really quite high, and while certain units do cost a fair bit, it does seem that it might be even worse than just their core rules, as they've got some absolutely great movement shenanigans, and the very easy ability to do a sort of broken devastating wounds combo, plugging in Fate Dice of 6 with Farseers to anything that deals a decent amount of devastating wound shooting, and just hoovering entire units off the board. Going through their rules, their main army rule is Strands of Fate, 12 essentially miracle dice at the start of the game, certainly less ways to regenerate them compared with Sisters of Battle, but they do get a lot more to start with. It might be arguably better to have them weighted towards the front of the game anyway. They can be plugged into certain key roles, in particular things that give devastating wounds, though there's plenty of other interesting applications. Advances and charges are also big, and they do combine rather powerfully indeed with the Farseer buffs. Very cheap Farseers at either 65 points or 75 points, they can change your bad faith dice to a 6, everyone's favourite miracle dice result, as Sisters of Battle players will tell you. That's perhaps biggest on things that deal mortal wounds on 6s, in particular both Wraith Knights and D-Cannons. That's either d6 plus 2 or 2d6 mortal wounds right then and there, provided you've hit your target with at least one attack, and that's something that's very likely to happen given the innate rerolls for the detachment, rerolling one hit and wound, which is absolutely massive on any anti-tank guns to start with. Perhaps doubling down on that problem is the fact that it's just really easy to deal that kind of damage to enemy units that would normally be out of sight. The Wraith Knight's an enormously efficient datasheet and gets the towering keyword, so anything that was cowering behind a ruin that's got some windows in can be just shot straight through by the Wraith Knight if it can get a physical line of sight to them, which is kind of problematic. And if the enemy does advance into the midfield, then the same can be achieved with the D-Cannon, firing out of line of sight just innately. That kind of mortal wound output is just point and delete for really quite a lot of units in the game. Otherwise, beyond that, you can have Fate's Messenger for a few more auto 6s. That could be nice on Wraithguard in particular, which really seem quite cheap now. The Phoenix Gem could allow a bit of character resurrection to protect your Farseer maybe, and their Battle Host attachment gives them just an enormous amount of movement shenanigans, all sorts of ways to boost your movement or move out of phase. They can move, shoot, move the same as the Tau, but they can also double down on that with Phantasm as well, which is arguably even better. A reactive movement to the enemy movement phase, getting your squad either safe behind terrain or getting them out of range for your opponent to charge. Overall, just enormously crazily powerful rules, and it doesn't appear that the points cost really reflects them all that well. Besides perhaps the most obvious things like Farseers, Wraith Knights and D-Cannons, things like Guardians are quite nice to farm up some more Fate dice. Fire Prisms seem to be surprisingly low costed at 125 points for their massive damage, plus the ability to all-focus fire through your favourite fire prism with the best position, and they do have some other long-range good firepower support like the Night Spinner perhaps. Overall, it does seem that most people have the Aeldari build as basically the strongest faction in the game, and not by a small margin. Compared with the next highest on the list, they're just voted a clear 8% clear of the Space Marines. Definitely seems to be the faction to beat at the moment, and I think with this many mortal wound shenanigans and this powerful movement things that they can do, they probably do need toning down to some extent. Particularly for some of the lower tier armies, I feel like playing against Eldar is just going to have them be a massive uphill struggle that's not going to be very rewarding. So anyway, there we have it, a bit of a talk through some of the strongest and weakest factions in Warhammer 40k, and a few of the strengths and weaknesses of each. Obviously this is all a little bit prospective at the moment. We might well find out that certain combos come to light in some armies and they move up and down these rankings. I certainly look forward to taking a look at some tournament data later in the year. Feel free to let me know your thoughts on any of these. Do you think they should have been rated higher or lower? And feel free to let me know any more cool tricks or combos that certain armies have. There's definitely a lot to piece together in Warhammer 40k at the moment. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been finding videos like this useful, I would just like to quickly mention that the channel does have a Patreon page as well, which is the main way in which I can spend so much time making Warhammer videos like this. I do try and give channel patrons some good advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.